Binding is the final step in finishing a quilt. It is the fabric that is used to cover and keep intact the outer edges of a quilt. It is usually made from fabric that is cut on the bias and can be used to add another element to the quilt's design. You will need a ruler, rotary cutter, clips or pins, scissors, a fabric marker, binding, a cutting mat, a quilt of course, and a sewing machine. Before adding your binding, it's important that the edges of your quilt are straight. Using the rotary cutter and cutting mat, trim the edges of the fabric to ensure that they are all straight. Lay the binding along the edge of your quilt, leaving about a 10 or 12 inch tail. The longer the tail, the easier it will be to join the ends of your binding together. Make sure to line up the raw edges of your quilt and the raw edge of the binding. Place the quilt under your presser foot and sew a 1/4 inch in from the edge with a straight stitch. Continue sewing for 8 to 10 inches. Stop and check that everything is correct. Continue sewing until you reach a 1/4 inch from the edge of the first corner. Measure and mark it with your ruler if you like. Sew to this point and then backstitch once. Cut your threads and remove the quilt from the machine. Fold the binding up and over so there is a fold going diagonally through the middle and so that the edges line up along both corners. Your corner should look like this. Then start sewing again from the end with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Repeat this process on all 4 corners of your quilt. Lay the ends of your binding so they overlap on the edge of the quilt. We want them to overlap by 2.5 inches. Rule and mark this spot and cut with scissors. Unfold the binding and overlap the ends with the right sides facing inwards. Get your ruler and rule diagonally across the binding. Place a pin along the line and sew. Lay the quilt nice and flat and fold the binding back to check it lines up perfectly with the edge of your quilt. If you are happy, then cut the excess seam allowance back to a 1/4 inch and finger press the seam open. Then finish sewing the binding down, backstitching at both ends. Ironing is optional but can be helpful. Lay your quilt flat with the right side up and iron the binding flat. This will help when pulling it to the back side of the quilt. To do this, pull the binding over the edge and clip in place all the way around. You can either sew the binding down by hand or use a sewing machine. If you are looking for a super quick and easy option, you can also use a small amount of fabric glue. After applying the glue, you can iron the binding down, as the heat will help set the glue. Before sewing down your corners, you may need to trim some of the seam allowance of the quilt if the binding isn't sitting right. Use a pin or awl to help fold the corner before sewing down. Continue sewing until the binding is sewn all the way around your quilt.